I am very happy to introduce this morning Bryan Smale, who's the director of the Canadian Index of Wellbeing, which is housed in the Faculty of Applied Health Sciences at the University of Waterloo. Dr. Smale is a professor in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies and cross-appointed to the Department of Geography and Environmental Management. He received his PhD in geography from the University of Western Ontario and both his master's and BA in leisure studies from the University of Waterloo. He is currently a member of the Statistics Canada Advisory Committee on Social Conditions, an advisor to the Vanier Institute's Canadian Family Wellbeing Index, on the board of directors of the Canadian Association of Leisure Studies, and editor-in-chief of Leisure, Loisoir. Now, I just, on a personal note, would like to say that I was a member of the original design team that designed and developed the Canadian Index of Wellbeing and launched it. And we needed to go and find a home for it. And we found that home at the University of Waterloo. And Bryan Smale has taken that responsibility to carry the CIW forward into new heights and breadth of application to help educate Canadians about all the aspects that go into our well-being. Interesting footnote here, Bryan. I see that you're working with the Vanier Institute for the Family on a family well-being index. That was a seed I planted with them at a research conference a few years back. I'm glad to see it's taken root. So with that, Bryan, I'm going to turn it over to you, and happy to have you with us today.
Thank you, Malcolm. You stole my thunder a little bit. I was going to do a shout out to you for your early involvement with the CIW. Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm just going to share my screen with you here, and we'll get started. Okay, what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of background about how the CIW came about and where we currently are in some of the new initiatives that we've been taking on, and sort of weave that into a little bit to the implications of our work for not just well-being overall, but also the findings that we have with respect to mental health for Canadians all over the country. So the Canadian Index of Wellbeing is actually part of something that, for lack of a better term, has taken on the beyond GDP movement around the world. And there's a number of initiatives going on right now that many of you may be aware of. At the international level, certainly the OECD's Better Life Index has taken root within that organization for the 37 member countries there. The Human Development Index, the World Happiness Report, another Canadian, John Helliwell out at UBC, has been one of the principals behind that. And the Social Progress Index out of Britain. All of these gather data together and report on measures that seem to be related to people's well-being, their happiness, their life satisfaction in particular. And they make comparisons amongst countries, and you probably have seen many of these as well, but they've all come about in response to GDP very often being used as a measure of a country's progress, as opposed to what it really is just economic productivity. At the national level, probably the most famous and long-standing example is in Bhutan, where they have the Gross National Happiness Index, and they actually use that instead of GDP to track the progress within the country. More recently, New Zealand, Scotland, UK, Italy, Wales, Iceland have all sort of dipped their toes into the waters of developing well-being frameworks for their governments. These are government-led. The footing that they have in guiding policy vary to some extent. Last year, New Zealand released its first well-being budget that comes out of a framework that's in the Treasury Department. And other countries are going a little bit further along that way as well, including Scotland with its national performance framework. And they are working as well in both instances with civil society, not-for-profit organizations within their countries to ensure that they're not entirely economically driven, but do get at other aspects as well. So similar to a lot of these, we, as Malcolm mentioned, we emerged in response to that preoccupation with GDP and wanted to get at the things that actually matter to Canadians, you know, beyond economic productivity of the country. And the way that we approached it is back in the early 2000s, there was a series of focus groups with Canadians, experts, everyday Canadians, Indigenous populations, academics, other experts, and so forth. But we wanted their advice on the things that actually were meaningful in their lives, the things that they felt contribute to a higher quality of life. And I think, you know, one of the differences between what we've done is that we've built from the ground up and have very much a conceptual framework in terms of these are the things that Canadians value, as opposed to building a framework that's based on the available data. And most of the available data is economic in nature, so a lot of the other frameworks do tend to still, you know, privilege economic indicators as a measure of progress, and we've tried to steer away from that. So I'm jumping to the end of the story a little bit more quickly here. This is our framework. So the Canadian Index of Wellbeing actually operates on 3 levels. At the top level, the index itself is an amalgam of indicators within 8 domains. And basically, we use that index as a companion to track over time to see how well Canadians' well-being is doing relative to things like GDP, to see whether it's moving along at the same pace. We also have a dashboard approach by looking at each of these 8 domains that emerged out of those conversations with Canadians. And as you can see, there's probably 4 that most people will regard as the usual suspects. Living standards, which is how the economy plays out in people's day-to-day lives, healthy populations, education, and the environment. So the kinds of things that are very often part of the, you know, the political conversation cycle. But the other 4 that emerged, and these came from, you know, the Canadians themselves saying, these things are really valuable to us if we actually want to have a high quality of life. Excuse me. So they identified things like community vitality, the degree to which people feel connected to their community, that they don't experience discrimination, that they volunteer, that they feel safe in their neighborhoods and so forth. Democratic engagement, the degree to which they feel part of the process, they are engaged in democracy, but they also feel that their voices are being heard and change is being reflected there. Time use, which is really kind of our work-life balance domain. And it probably is more about work, family, community, and personal life balance, and the kinds of things that impede on our ability to do that, whether it's how we allocate our time, systemic things that affect how our time is managed, and so forth. And then importantly, you know, certainly for me, given my home department, is leisure and culture. People feel that the stuff that they did during their, you know, free time was perhaps one of the most important domains of their life, where they felt that they could really, you know, feel human, feel that they could express themselves in meaningful ways. So as I mentioned, this whole process, you know, gave rise to, you know, this vision for ourselves to share the highest well-being status by identifying, developing, and publicizing statistical measures to offer clear, valid, and regular reporting on the progress toward well-being goals and outcomes. It's rooted in Canadian values because one of the other things that emerged from those conversations were, as you can see in this word bubble, these are the kinds of things that people continually return to during those conversations. Fairness, diversity, inclusion, sustainability, health, equity, all of which to help reduce inequities within our country for those groups that are most marginalized. So as I mentioned, we started with these focus groups to identify the domains that cut across all parts of society. They were run all across the country. That's how we eventually whittled down the things that people identified into our 8 domains. When we got to that stage, later in the 2000s, we engaged with research teams all across the country, academics and consultants and experts in well-being, each with expertise in one of the domain areas. And they basically went through the literature to identify those types of indicators, those measures that seem to be highly correlated with people's overall well-being. So this is when I became involved, and I wrote the leisure and culture domain report and identified a huge number of indicators of things that people do, the experiences they have during their leisure time, whether it's physical activity, social leisure, arts and culture, visitation to parks, all the kinds of things that we know made significant contributions to people's well-being, and then whittled it down to the 8 indicators that became part of the overall index. So what that's culminated in over the years are our reports on how are Canadians really doing. And as I mentioned, we compile these statistics over time. We started with 1994 as a benchmark year and tracked all the indicators, tracked them within the domains, and then compiled the domains into the overall index to see how we're doing on all of these other indicators within these domains. Now, we don't weight the indicators. Most of the data we get come from national surveys by StatsCan, some data from OECD and some other sources. But getting data that we can get over time that's valid, reliable, shows high consistency in the literature in terms of their connections with well-being was particularly important. So this was probably the graphic that got us the most notoriety from the first day, is when we contrasted our tracking of well-being against GDP. And this is from our last report. We're currently working on our next report. Part of the delay is that we have to wait until we've got sufficient data to actually make a statement. But what you can see here is that well-being has tracked well behind growth in GDP. And even if you look at around 2008 to 2010, in the aftermath of the recession of 2008, you see the GDP declined, but immediately it started tracking back up on the same trajectory. The impact of the recession on people's well-being was also felt, but the recovery has not been as great. And over time, that gap between GDP and people's well-being has actually been widening, which is obviously of great concern to us. One of the things we're thinking about with COVID right now and the impact it's having on all of our lives, the lessons we can learn from how people are recovering and the things that really gets them back and improves their well-being can be seen in the impact of the recession here from 2008. We also, as I mentioned, tracked it on the dashboard, and some domains are doing better than others. So in education, to some degree, healthy populations, community vitality rebounded following the recession considerably. A lot of what we've seen anecdotally is it's communities coming together to support one another in the face of crisis. But what we also see is that the trajectory of some domains like environment and leisure and culture has actually done worse since we started in 1994, even at a time when we had the resources to make investments in those areas that were most important to people. I want to point out, living standards in particular, because it isn't just about economic productivity that GDP reflects. Living standards and the measures we use there reflect how the economy changes, affects and plays out in people's lives. So we have things like income gap, the quality of people's work and so forth. And what we see is that there was a huge impact on people's living standards following the recession, and it did not recover. So despite all of look how well we're doing with GDP, it's not actually being seen in Canadians' lives to the same degree. So what we've really tried to do is measure what matters, but obviously the next step is to take those measures and try to make them matter in terms of changing the way that we do things. So as part of our reporting, one of the things that's really important to us is not just to sort of throw down the results and say, hey, what are you going to do about it? But also offer some policy directions on where we can actually make change to improve people's quality of life. And so what we do when we have the data is we pull together policy experts for each of those 8 domains. We put them together in groups where they may not know each other across domains and say, look at the data from all of these domains and come up with innovative social policy solutions that cut across the spectrum of these, because this is really a systems approach, highly interconnected. People don't live in vacuums within each one of these aspects of their lives. So see, some steps that you can take that would actually improve our well-being, but have an impact across people's lives. And from that workshop, we developed this chapter on suggested policy directions with primary recommendations. And the one that we came up with, and this goes back to our report in 2016, and it's certainly not new in the conversation now, but we advocated for a universal basic income, and not just because it was proving successful to raise people out of poverty, but it created access, and it affected people's lives in a myriad of ways, in that they could get better housing, better food, live in parts of the community that could get their kids to schools, they could meet other people, they had opportunities to take advantage of the leisure and cultural resources within their community, their kids could go to better schools and so forth. So, that was the paramount one that we saw. We know there's challenges associated with it, but we still feel it's a powerful way to give people the resources to improve their lot in life, and they do make good choices. There's evidence for that. We also advocated for a pan-Canadian educational strategy that was lifelong. I think, as Trish Hennessy mentioned in her keynote address, an upstream approach to health. We don't have a healthcare system. We have a sick care system. We don't anticipate and work towards improving people's health so they can stay out of the healthcare system. Advocating for more collaborative power within communities, more access to leisure and culture. And obviously we need more data on social and environmental concerns in order to be able to do this effectively. So we've also been involved in doing this work at the provincial and territorial level. The data that we gather, we want to make sure that we can disaggregate it to the provincial level. So we've done the same type of work in Ontario last year, in Nova Scotia, and in Yukon we're working with currently. And just this a few months ago released the How Are Residents of Saskatchewan Really Doing. So it tracks indicators on all the domains and encounters them, or compares them basically to what's going on nationally. Not to sort of say this province is doing well or not so well, but it helps guide policy response in areas where people are at most need within those particular provinces. What we discovered quite early on, though, is that much of the data that we have available to us is you can get at the national level. Not all of it is necessarily available at the provincial level if we want to do those pan-Canadian kinds of comparisons. And certainly we got more and more inquiries at the community level. Can you, do well-being tracking within our community? And then the data really thins out. I mean, even some of the large national surveys, you just don't have, the same data availability due to the lack of sample size within mid-sized communities. So basically what we did is we developed the Community Wellbeing Survey. We designed a survey that actually asked people in communities about aspects of their lives related to all 8 domains. We measured their well-being, a whole series of demographic characteristics so we could see which groups within the communities were most at risk, from falling behind in their quality of life, so that communities which are more nimble in terms of developing programs and strategies could actually address where those needs were greatest. So I'm going to mention we've just the last year did the Community Wellbeing Survey across the province of Nova Scotia. So I thought I'd share a little bit about this, because within this, even though we have a mental health indicator within our national index, we also measure it the same way in our community survey, which we did in Nova Scotia. So we got a random sample of households from across the province, stratified by different regions. As I mentioned, we got at people's behaviors and perceptions across all 8 domains, their well-being, demographics, and then compiled all those results for Engage Nova Scotia, a not-for-profit organization there, and all of their partners, to see what was going on across the province. So this basically shows you, we actually contacted over 80,000 households within the province. We ended up with a final sample of just under 13,000 respondents from everywhere. And then we took the data and weighted it by sex, age, and region to make sure that the responses match the profile better for the province, so we can say with confidence that this is actually the voices of Nova Scotians talking about their well-being. Here's a couple of things related to mental health that I wanted to show you, and this goes beyond just sort of the basic results. But this gets to the intersection of how mental health, life satisfaction, or well-being connects to, other characteristics. And so this is somewhat similar to the social determinants of health approach. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is the interconnections between these things. We see that with increased mental health reporting, there's also a corresponding increase in people's life satisfaction, but it's very much tied to their incomes and their ages. So you can see a direct relationship here that as people's income increases, they have higher self-reported mental health, and their life satisfaction or quality of life is also that much higher as well. So those people in the low income categories are at a tremendous disadvantage here and at greatest risk of low mental health and consequently lower quality of life. The same holds true for age, where we see that mental health actually is higher amongst older adults, which belies some of the popular myths. And they're also the least socially isolated, which again sort of belies some of the beliefs of that. It's younger people that are struggling most with mental health and also with life satisfaction and quality of life. Another aspect we looked at was living arrangements that people have. And as you can see in that lower left corner, lower mental health, lower life satisfaction. Adults that are sharing accommodation, which tend to be singles, they tend to be younger people sharing with friends. So they may be sharing, but there may not be intimate connections and support systems immediately around them. And the other, adults living with children at home, those are single parents. And they're the ones that show up very much across all our results as struggling the most with mental health issues, overall quality of life, and so on. So our survey is currently running right now in Yukon. And this editorial cartoon just showed up on Monday, in fact, in the Yukon News. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that we've been asked about this in the context of COVID, but part of the argument is that this is an ideal time to consider what the impacts are on people's well-being when we're facing such a crisis in our day-to-day lives. And COVID certainly reflects that to a high degree, but our surveys can still, represent all of those aspects of people's lives that help them deal with these types of crises. When we take a look at mental health across the country, and our surveys are largely population-based adult surveys. We don't really get at children and youth, but we can see the impact in the light blue here on the graph that COVID has actually had on people's mental health in different age groups. And we can see the significant impact it's had on younger people. Our data doesn't reflect that as well, but the next speaker, Lisa Wolff, who I'm really proud to have had an opportunity to work with, does have information on youth, as you might expect. And so she's going to pick it up from there. But the message I want to leave you with is that because our lives are so highly interconnected in terms of all of these things that contribute to our quality of life, we've got to move away from placing the economy at the center of all of our decision-making within the political arena and put well-being at the center, because it gives us a more systems approach to understanding people's quality of life and leads us to the kinds of policy that can really bring about far more positive social change in people's lives as well, particularly those people that are facing the greatest inequities. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan. Really informative and gives us some substance as to, I think, to support some of the experience that we've had and also some insight into what's happening with people before and after the whole impact of COVID. So we'll open it up for questions after Lisa's presentation, if that's okay with you, and hear what Lisa has to say. And then there's Q&A, and don't forget there are Q&A section of Whova that you can enter questions into. And timing being good, we will also take hand raising for questions. So I will at this point ask if Rebecca Francis could introduce our next speaker, and then we will thank both of them and offer time for questions.
Thank you, Patsy. Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Good morning, folks. I'm privileged this morning to introduce Lisa Wolff. Director of Policy and you may recognize Lisa from her very informative interview last week with CBC PEI, where she discussed the ASI Forum, youth mental health and the effects of the pandemic. Day to day, Lisa leads UNICEF Canada's advocacy and policy work to advance the rights of Canada's children. Lisa is a member of the Making Shifts network of Centers of Excellence, a past board member of PrevNet and the Canadian Coalition of the Rights of the Child. Lisa has a Bachelor of Environmental Studies from the University of Waterloo and a Bachelor and Masters of Education from the University of Toronto. In 2012, Lisa received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal from the Governor General of Canada, and we are honored to have her speak to us today. So Lisa, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to share this time with you and with Bryan, a really valued colleague in the Canadian Index of Child and Youth Wellbeing that I'm happy to share with you today. So just going to share. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, no problem.
Okay, super. I have time just to share a few highlights and insights from the Canadian Index of Child and Youth Wellbeing about the status of children's mental health, which is situated, of course, in a broader well-being context. And hope to provoke some thoughts about the implications for upstream policy measures that could address some of the root causes of children's mental well-being or poor mental health, and prevent poor mental health as well as boost overall well-being. This index took 3 years to develop, guided very much by our partnership with the Canadian Index of Wellbeing and Bryan's leadership. It involved well over 100 adult experts across the country and a lot of young people who didn't always agree with each other, and made for, I think, a much better index than if we hadn't had all of that intergenerational work. The first iteration of the index was released just last fall, which seems now like a very long time ago. And it is a baseline on which the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly amplified some of the things some of the signals that we've picked up in the index. It's altering children's mental health, as we know. And I think the baseline index data certainly makes a good case for coming out of the pandemic on the other side, doing much better for children. And it's a baseline from which we can track the impacts of the pandemic long into the future, because certainly it is likely to cast a long shadow over children's lives. So why children and youth? You've just seen that the Canadian Index of Wellbeing is a very powerful compass of well-being for Canadians. And why measure the status of children and youth distinct from the general population? I think some of what Bryan showed you helps to start to uncover why we would do this. You saw that life satisfaction for young people is very low compared to older people. So young people certainly experience well-being differently. Another reason is that kids need different things than adults. They're in a distinct stage of human development. There's a fleeting opportunity to ensure that they have access to immunization, to good education, to breastfeeding, to play and free play. They're also more vulnerable typically than adults to deprivations like food insecurity and to exposures like air pollution. And they're also more vulnerable due to their dependence and their legal status, more vulnerable to exploitation, for instance. Another reason why we have a Canadian Index of Child and Youth Wellbeing is that kids think that different things are important to their well-being than adults do. I think you will see from different dashboards and surveys that are available to describe child and youth well-being that adults place a great deal of importance on educational achievement, on health risk behaviors. There's endless data about youth drug use, and in some ways, I mean, these are important things to measure, but they're also a bit paradoxical because this generation is far less likely to engage in health risk behaviors than the ones that came before it. And they get among the highest, grades. They have among the highest levels of school performance compared to their peers in other rich countries. So what else is important to matter? Well, kids say that, for instance, relationships, the quality and connection of relationships around them are really important. So we need to measure some of those things too. Adults also tend sometimes to over or underestimate how kids are experiencing life. We've seen surveys that show us a pattern of adults underestimating the extent to which children and young people feel that they have mental health challenges, underestimate the experience of bullying, for instance. And we monitor children and youth because really they are the lead indicators of the future of Canada. How we're raising this generation speaks to how well the future population will be and the future of our country. So UNICEF believes that, and I hope you will agree, that really it's the measure of all these aspects of children's lives that is the truest measure also of our country. And as Bryan said, not just the GDP, the level of economic wealth that we generate. So the Canadian Index of Child and Youth Wellbeing is in some ways a similar construct to the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. We have 9 dimensions of life to support a comprehensive and balanced view of childhood. Each dimension contains indicators of the state or the status of children. Just a quick note about the indicators. We have probably far too many. We have 125. And we cover a range of life from birth to age 18. By the status of children or the state of children, what we mean is things that can be observed in children or reported by them, which is probably as downstream as you can get in terms of how you measure well-being. And indicators of mental health or mental well-being are spread across most of these dimensions, although to some extent every indicator can influence or be influenced by mental health. About the data, we used, again, the most recent data available just before the pandemic came along. We use national indicators as the CIW does because they really help us pick up patterns that are not always visible at smaller scales, and they can be used for benchmarking by communities, just as the CIW community reports do, for instance. So I'm going to share with you just a few highlights about the state of children's well-being and in particular mental health that surfaced in the index, and a little bit about how the pandemic may be shaping that. But as we go, I would just ask you to think about these questions and bring your own insights to them. Why are so many kids unhappy in this country? Are children and youth the canaries of economic, social, and environmental changes in Canada? And what policy measures would actually support good mental health and well-being? So we start with an overall measure of how children feel about their lives, which is probably our best proxy for overall well-being. And if we had to pick one thing to measure instead of 125, we would probably choose life satisfaction. And it's, I think, concerning that at a time of life when we hope that people are most carefree, that just about half of young people rate their life satisfaction as high. And I think what really surprised me when I saw the data is that almost a third report being sad or hopeless for a period of at least 2 weeks in the past year to an extent when it affected their normal life activities. In the health domain, we look at physical and mental health, and we use a spectrum of mental health measures from those that are affecting fewer children in a more extreme way, like suicide, to a more a common and shared measure of mental distress, which is the frequency in the past week in which children and youth have experienced symptoms like headache, stomach ache, difficulty sleeping that indicate mental distress. And it's as many as 1 in 3 experience that. In the belonging domain, again, we come back to what I mentioned earlier, the quality of relationships being so important, such a heavy influence on children's life satisfaction. And we see that many young people are not getting good support from their closest relationships. But on the other hand, it's encouraging that just about every child and young person has somebody they can talk to, somebody to turn to. And this presentation is available to you afterwards. I know I'm going very quickly through some of this data. Are we secure is a domain where we look at material security, including poverty. I think what stands out here is that, and I don't want to poke a bee's nest about the market basket measure and the debates about how we measure poverty that I'm not sure were settled with the federal government's choice of market basket measure in the new strategy. But I think what we're seeing here is that when we measure child poverty with the market basket measure, 1 in 10 in poverty is really not capturing the extent of risk and deprivation to children. When we use the international gold standard of the 50 or 60% below the median income, we see that 20% of young people are at risk of poverty, and what this also tells us is a lack of opportunity, and it aligns more with the rates of food insecurity and insecure work that parents have, which causes stress in the family and can dampen children's well-being. Are we protected? This is another domain where there are a number of indicators that influence children's mental well-being. In Canada, we have relatively high rates and persistent rates over the years of bullying. Roughly 1 in 4 experience regular frequent bullying, which research links strongly to lower life satisfaction. And as many as 1/3 of our kids are reporting discrimination, which can occur in the community, and certainly we see coming to the fore during COVID and weighs on mental health. Are we learning? So our kids get good grades at school. They're succeeding at school at a much higher rate than many of their peers in other countries. But school is not a place where they feel good. They're not feeling a lot of support. Bullying certainly has something to do with it, more difficult relationships with peers. But what we're seeing emerging, certainly in the last couple of years, is very strong indications that young people are feeling heavy pressure. School is a high pressure environment, and probably really helps explain some of the slide in mental health over the years and some of the mental health challenges that they're experiencing. Countries that report, and we don't measure this very well in Canada, but countries that report a lot of free play among children having more hours of unsupervised, unstructured play just to be kids, tend to have better mental health and higher life satisfaction. And there are some indications in the index that even our youngest children are not playing freely as much as they should. This may link to the highly scheduled, highly pressured environments that older young people are reporting, and that really takes away the time and space for free play. And are we connected to our environment? You know, modern child and youth well-being dashboards tend to pay attention to how children have access to clean air and water. We know that in Canada, as many as 1 in 10 households experience insecure access to water. And certainly we still have, I think, 61 boil water advisories in our First Nations communities as of this month. Concern about the environment is starting to weigh heavily on children's mental health. And Canada's young people are more environmentally aware than many of their peers in other rich countries, according to international surveys that we use to report on in the index. And I think we have to pay attention to the fact that that's also a factor weighing on the mental health of some. So what is going on here? What helps to explain some of these signals and trends in mental well-being? It's maybe not the most obvious explanation, but rising income inequality in Canada may be one of the most powerful explanations. What we're seeing is, you know, although screen time and media get a lot of blame for poor mental health and rising mental health challenges, really the slide in life satisfaction for children predates that. It goes back, we've been tracking it since 2002, and it seems to coincide with a sharp rise in income inequality, which has toxic effects across childhood. And I don't have time to really unpack that today, but you know, it does raise a question about why are children unhappy in a time of plenty. And we believe that at a certain level of wealth in rich countries, that has become more loosely coupled with well-being. There are countries like Slovenia that have far less national wealth than Canada, but overall better child well-being and mental health. Really, it's how wealth is shared that begins to matter more. And countries with wide inequities in income and between children have lower well-being. So child well-being is certainly, we think, a canary in the coal mine of these economic changes. And I think the CIW picks up that trend as well. I just want to conclude by showing you a couple of ways that we actually use the index. As Bryan said, you know, measuring well-being is one thing, but using that to create change is another. And again, our index is fairly new. It's only about a year old. We will track change over time in the future. But we've started to use the index in a couple of ways. On the left side of my screen, you see a wall at one of our youth solutions summits. We conducted one in Moncton last year, and this is these are 2-day sort of summits that we bring young people and adults in an intergenerational process to add young people's qualitative insights to the statistical data and develop prototype solutions for how to address their well-being in ways that matter to them. And it's yielded some very exciting prototypes, I must say. And then the other chart shows you a result from a pilot. We are also entering into community surveys for the Child and Youth Index, as the CIW does for the broader population. And working with Bryan and the CIW team and the Child and Youth Planning Table in Waterloo, we've just piloted the first community survey during COVID times, and it's showing some interesting things. I said the chart here you see is a familiar pattern we see with the national averages, where children's life satisfaction really declines as they get older and go through adolescence. But what we're seeing in the Waterloo survey during COVID times is the gender gap that we typically see, where girls, for instance, identify much more as having higher stress and poorer mental well-being. We're seeing a convergence in COVID, where boys are also in older adolescence feeling just as anxious and just as concerned about, you know, the future, the uncertainty, the disruption to their lives. So I think it's an exciting prospect to have some data about this that community can track and see the impacts of COVID as they go forward. And this survey will be available to communities probably next year. So that brings me to the end of this presentation. I just want to invite you to, on September 3rd, next Thursday, UNICEF is releasing report card 16 that looks at child and youth well-being in comparison to other rich countries. We're going to be picking up on some of these themes, and I think you might be surprised to see how Canada stacks up. So I invite you to join us next week. On Thursday, we have an event at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And with that, I hope we can open it up to some questions and comments.
All right, so there are a couple of questions on the session Q&A. I guess the first question will be for Bryan. So the question is, my question is in regards to what you said about increasing basic income and in turn helping parents, but their kids in better schools. While I absolutely agree in increasing basic income, especially in the Atlantic provinces, why not focus on making all schools better instead of just getting a handful of kids in better schools? So that would be directed towards Bryan. So for Lisa, what would be your recommendations to help youth during this time?
Well, we have been asking young people that very question since COVID began. UNICEF Canada and partners, including Boys and Girls Clubs, Students Commission of Canada, we have a U-Report platform where 600 young people from across the country answer digital poll questions about their perspectives on policy matters or current events and experiences. So it was ideally suited to COVID. It's a digital platform. And we've been asking them a lot of different questions about how they're experiencing COVID since it began, and how that experience is changing and how it's different for different young people. Just one thing I would highlight is what we're hearing from young people is the way that they manage their mental health proactively and preventively is to be connected with community programs. And I think that goes back to the statistic I shared with you that a lot of young people are not reporting high levels of support in their families among peers, but they all have somebody to talk to. That can be in their community programs, for instance. Disrupting those things, closing down those things, keeping them out of school is having major impacts on their ability to manage their mental health. And one of the messages we've heard from them loud and clear is, please open these things up as soon as you can. Please consider which of these things might actually be essential services. And at the same time, young people get a bad rap these days, I think, because it's perceived that they're not that concerned about health protection measures, not taking them as much. Well, children and adolescents are very concerned. That also comes through. They want to be health safe in accessing these things, but that's what we're hearing. That's the best way to support. That's their preferred way to manage their mental health, is to go back to those connections that they have in the community and at school.
Hi folks,
Okay.
Sorry about that. The internet went down at the house and I had to reboot my machine, so.
Okay. Well, Bryan, there was a question for you. I can reread that.
The one about improving schools?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
sorry, I got started and everything went dark on me. But
Okay.
yeah, one of the things that we advocate for with the CIW is taking a systems perspective in terms of like how things are so highly interconnected. And so I absolutely agree that, where, the need exists, improving the schools is certainly a step that should be taken, but it shouldn't be an either or set of solutions. It's, what are the things that we can do to improve, in this case, the education domain, the kind of support that's provided to children. And we see that pathway as being facilitated by a universal basic income where people actually do have choice by taking steps to improve schools and so forth. So this is, as I was mentioning, is that, if we have, turning back to sort of the theme of the session, if we put economics sort of at the heart of all of the decision making, then a lot of it sort of goes to, how do we change the infrastructure? And there's certainly a case to be made that, the sorts of resources that schools need to be better, should be facilitated as well. But it ends up missing, the fact that, Canadians may not have the resources to make the kind of choices that they want to make in support of their children's education. And a universal basic income, in our view, would be one of those pathways, along with improving schools. So, as I say, it's not an either or. I think, that there's multiple ways in addressing some of these challenges. And it shouldn't just be, as I say, an either or type thing. If you'll indulge me, one of the other questions that was posted was how to address these issues with policymakers. I'm sure that Lisa has tremendous experience advocating on behalf of children and youth in the country. Our experience has been sort of interesting. When we first got started, our co-chairs for the Canadian Index of Wellbeing were the Honorable Roy Romano and Monique Bejean, both of whom had obviously tremendous connections in Ottawa in opening doors to take our message to government about how a well-being perspective, an upstream health perspective, and so forth could actually make a kind of positive change we're interested in. And of course, when we started issuing our reports and sending fact sheets and so forth, not surprisingly, we got crickets. And what we've discovered is that we're getting far more attention from upper levels of governments because of the grassroots community-based work that we're doing, because they're seeing the change, they're seeing how communities are stepping up and organizing together in collaborative groups to try to improve quality of life within their communities. So if you see Canada as a garden and this well-being work going on in these communities, these flowers are popping up all over the place and government's taking notice. And now within the last year and a half, we are actually consulting with the federal government about their well-being agenda. And we actually are fairly optimistic that it might play out in the upcoming budget year, in large part because of the kinds of issues that we're currently facing.
And to that, I would add, in terms of policy implications, on the one hand, what we're seeing is really, again, I'll mention the toxic effects of income inequality on many aspects of children's lives. And I know, again, it feels really upstream to say that. But, what that does is create a lot of economic anxiety in families, a lot of worry about falling backwards. It makes getting out of poverty more difficult. It makes looking ahead at the kind of opportunities that we have and the distance between ourselves and the most advantaged people feel really far away, and so again, that really weighs on people's anxieties. People feel insecure again in a time of plenty, even though wealth has been accumulating, and that creates stress within families. It creates these kinds of adaptations where families put a lot of pressure on their children to do well at school, to be highly scheduled in activities rather than playing freely. Countries with more income inequality have poor child health outcomes. They have more markers of violence like bullying and child fighting and even homicide. Canada is no exception to that pattern. Income inequality, frays the social fabric, and it makes sense then that it shows up in difficult relationships and poor mental health. So on the one hand, we need to do more to curb income inequality and share wealth fairly and invest more of it in children, because Canada does not invest as much of the wealth that it does have in children compared to other countries. But at the same time, you know, the policies that could mitigate the impacts of inequality from the start, where it really makes a difference in the early years, like early childcare and education, like more generous parental benefits, or if you will, a basic income that can lift kids out of poverty, like universal parental leave instead of, you know, allowing access to only about 2/3 of mothers and therefore infants. Those policies that can soften the impacts of income inequality are not sufficient either, and we need to build on recent progress to build those. So none of those look like mental health solutions, but you know, upstream, that's where we're seeing some of the most powerful opportunities to be bolder and better.
So what would you recommend to help youth during COVID and their feelings of stress? So how would you go about helping educating youth manage their coping skills?
Well, what young people are telling us is, you know, they've got a lot of their own solutions. They're checking in with each other as best they can. I think as things start to open up, you know, they're in small bubbles. I think that, you know, what adults can do is recognize that young people do need social interactions as much as possible with others in safe ways. And I'll just come back to, you know, let's think about what essential services are. You know, young people have been doing their best and making sacrifices to plank the curve. If everybody can keep community transmission low, it will allow that space for young people to have more opportunity to go back to their community programs and stay in school.
Lisa, is there, you may know better than I, but in terms of more perhaps a concrete example, some of the services and collaborations that the Child and Youth Planning Table in Waterloo Region are doing, would that be some resources?
Yeah, I'm not totally familiar with their local programs that they're running. You know, most communities have tried to sustain some kind of virtual connections with young people, but which is, you know, super. But I think we're at a point now where we're really emerging into allowing more physical interactions. And in the Atlantic, you know, you've done such a great job of keeping community transmission low. I think the message is, you know, is it time to ensure that children and youth are the priority and that they can go back to their clubs and their programs in a safe way as well.
There's a hand that's raised with Diane Oikle. I think Andrew just happened to spot it.
Hi. I wanted to pick up, this is a comment, probably something that I'm struggling with more than a question, but Lisa on one of her slides had talked about school and you know, that kids don't often, I'm paraphrasing, but that kids don't feel as safe or happy in school, and I'm struggling then with the balance of that, where, you know, with the pandemic and schools have been closed down, and we know that home also isn't the safest place for all kids to be, and some kids need to be back in school because they're actually, that's the best part of their day, and you know, that just rips me every time that I think about that, about how kids are actually safer and happier at school. And so I'm not challenging, I'm just, there's this, what do we do with that? You know, it's heartbreaking that for some kids, they're not okay anywhere, you know, and that's big. So I'm just throwing it out there that that when you put that up there, that the level of that just hit me, that it.
Yeah, it's a paradox that, as you know, as difficult as the school environment is for some, and again, we believe, given the emerging evidence and what we hear from kids directly, because we ask them a lot, it's the pressure on them to succeed, and the challenges like bullying, right, that you know, are part of, again, a social fabric that originates outside the school, but it's played out in school relationships. That is a problem. What we can do is, you know, reimagine what school will be like in the fall by supporting young people to recover socially and emotionally and mentally as much as academically. If we start with more attention to their need to recover in those other areas, I think we're going to see that we can use schools again, because young people want to go back by and large, right? They just don't want to go back to that same pressurized environment. Can we alleviate that as we go back? Can we put more attention initially on the social and mental recovery and worry a little less about the academic recovery that will come? I think that's my takeaway.
Yep. Bryan, can you help at all?
No.
No.
No, I think Lisa's answer, you know, was really good. I mean, it's clearly a challenge, and I mean, even teaching at the university, you know, we're being asked to, you know, focus much more on ensuring the, you know, mitigating the sort of stress levels that a lot of the students are sort of feeling about moving to online teaching if they have to be on campus, some of the controls that are in place. You know, for some of those small units working in labs and so forth, and worrying less about the academic side, not putting so much pressure on, you know, grading and assignments and so forth, you know, to help them through the process. And, you know, so, you know, balancing between ensuring the well-being of the students and ensuring that they get, you know, the academic content to the degree that we feel it is adequate to move ahead, I think is what's most important.
Yeah, okay, thank you both for that.
And I just want to say thank you very much. Time is just eaten up here, a very good conversation and discussion. I want to thank Andrew Culberson for moderating. Thank you, Andrew. And also Bryan and Lisa for your really informative presentations and responses in the discussion time. I would encourage everyone to make connections. If you have more questions, to ask those of Lisa and Bryan. You have their speaker profiles. You can send messages to them. That you can engage in Whova follow up if you have something. There is a question that was asked about, can you discuss briefly the role of race in the well-being of youth? And perhaps we can have more time and more dialogue around that as a topic in another session, because obviously time has passed now and people are moving to break, but it is a very current issue and one that we all need to understand a little bit more as well. So if you can respond, if those of you, Bryan and Lisa, if you can take a look at the Q&A session questions in Whova, and there's a place there you can respond to them, that would be great. Okay, thanks once again, both of you, and I'll be in touch with you, and you will get our thank you package in the mail. It's going to be posted this time. Can't give it to you in person. So again, thanks. I'll see everybody at the concurrent sessions. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.